Rome, Italy, October 1958. Ella Fitzgerald was in her dressing room at the Teatro Sistina, 40 minutes before curtain when someone knocked at the door. Her manager opened it. A production assistant was standing outside, holding a small folded note on cream-colored paper. "Someone in the theater asked me to deliver this to Miss Fitzgerald personally," the assistant said. She said, well, she asked if she might come backstage to say hello. After the performance, if Miss Fitzgerald was willing, the manager took the note, looked at the name written on the outside, and turned to Ella with an expression she'd rarely seen on his face. "Who is it?" Ella asked. He handed her the note, written in a precise, elegant script, Audrey Hepburn. Ella looked at the name, looked at her manager. "Audrey Hepburn wants to meet me. Apparently, she's here, in the theater, front row from what I understand." Ella looked at the note again. The handwriting was unmistakably careful, the kind of writing that suggested the person had thought about what to say and taken time to say it clearly. The note itself was short, simply that she had loved Ella's music since she was very young, that she was honored to be in the audience tonight, and that she would be enormously grateful for even a few minutes of Miss Fitzgerald's time. Ella had received many requests for backstage visits over the years. Most she declined. She was particular about the time before and after performances, needing quiet and preparation before, needing to decompress and simply be still afterward. She didn't like the performative quality of celebrity meetings, the mutual acknowledgement of fame for its own sake. But something about this note was different, the word enormously used without irony, the absence of the usual social performance in the language. Since she was very young, not the generic fan claim of long admiration, but something specific about time and place. "Tell her yes," Ella said. After the performance, what followed was a concert that those who attended it still talked about years later. Ella's voice in October 1958 was in one of its finest periods. She was 40 years old. The songbook series recording had given her interpretive depth she hadn't fully accessed in her younger years, and she was performing in Rome, a city that responded to music with a particular quality of attention that she'd always appreciated. She sang for 2 hours. The Teatro Sistina, with its warm acoustics and intimate size, held perhaps 800 people, and she could feel the room in the way that skilled performers feel rooms, as a living thing, breathing together, giving back what she was offering in a continuous exchange. In the front row, Audrey Hepburn sat very still and listened. Ella noticed her during the third song. She was impossible not to notice, partly because she was Audrey Hepburn, one of the most recognizable faces in the world after Roman Holiday and funny face in the career that had been building since 1951, and partly because of the quality of her attention. Most audience members, however appreciative, showed their appreciation in visible ways, small movements, smiles, leaning toward companions to share reaction. Audrey was entirely still. Eyes forward, listening with the kind of complete absorption that Ella recognized as the quality she most valued in an audience. After the final bow, after the sustained applause that Italian audiences gave with particular generosity, Ella returned to her dressing room and waited. Audrey Hepburn arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied only by a small woman who appeared to be an assistant. She was 29 years old, already an Academy Award winner, already one of the most famous people in the world. She was wearing simple clothes, not the carefully assembled elegance of her public appearances, but the kind of clothes someone wears when they're not planning to be photographed. She looked, Ella thought, slightly nervous. "Miss Fitzgerald," Audrey said. Her accent was the distinctive hybrid of her background, British educated with traces of something else underneath. "Thank you so much for agreeing to see me. I know you must be, I know the time after a performance is. I'm sorry if this isn't." Zishin, Ella looked at this woman who had charmed the entire world and who was, in this small dressing room, visibly uncertain whether she was welcome. "Sit down," Ella said. "Tell me about Holland." Audrey stopped. "I'm sorry. In your note you said you'd loved my music since you were young. You wrote it like someone who means something specific by it. I'm guessing Holland." Audrey sat down slowly. "How did you know?" "Your accent, and something about how you wrote the note." "Not like an American fan, like a European, someone who found American music during the war when it wasn't supposed to be there." Audrey was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, Holland, Arnhem during the occupation. My mother had an old phonograph and some records that had been acquired before everything became difficult. She kept them hidden. She played them in the evenings, quietly, so nobody outside could hear. She paused. I was 6, 7, 8 years old. The war was happening all around us, and in the evenings my mother would put on records and we would listen. Which ones? Yours, Audrey said simply. Mostly yours, some others, but yours especially. She looked at Ella carefully. Your voice was the thing that made me believe the world could be different from what I was seeing. That somewhere it was beautiful, that somewhere people made beautiful things and other people received them, and that was, she stopped, started again. You were the proof that beauty existed, when I needed that proof. Ella was quiet for a long moment. She understood something about this kind of testimony. She'd received it before, people telling her that her music had been with them during difficult times, had carried them through something. She always received these accounts with gratitude and believed them and tried to understand the weight of what was being said. But this was different, not a difficult time, a catastrophe. A child in Arnhem during the Nazi occupation, which had lasted 5 years and had included the terrible Battle of Arnhem in 1944 when Audrey was 15, which had left the city devastated and the population facing starvation in what became known as the Hunger Winter of 1944-1945. Audrey had weighed under 90 pounds by the war's end. She had seen things that children should not see. And in the evenings, while all of that was happening, her mother had put on records. How old were you when you first heard me? Ella asked. 6 or 7, Audrey said. I'm not certain. The early war years. I was in my 20s then, recording those first songs with Chick Webb's orchestra. I didn't know who you were, I just knew the voice. I asked my mother once, I said, who is this? And she said, an American woman, a singer, a very great singer. She smiled slightly. I believed her. Your English is extraordinary, Ella said. Was English spoken at home? My mother was Dutch-British. English was the private language, the one we used when we didn't want certain people to understand what we were saying. Audrey paused, and the language of the records, the songs were in English. I learned some of the words before I understood what they meant, just the sound of them, the music. Which songs do you remember? Audrey thought for a moment. Then, very quietly, she hummed it. Few bars of something, one of the Chick Webb recordings from the late 1930s, a song Ella had recorded before the war. Ella recognized it immediately. A tisket, a tasket, she said. Yes, I was very young, it seemed like. Audrey searched for the word. Like light, that's the only description I have. In a time that was very dark, that particular sound was like light. Ella looked at this woman, the movie star, the face that had graced the most elegant magazine covers of the decade, the actress whose combination of vulnerability and grace had made her one of the most beloved performers of her era, and saw underneath all of that the child she was describing. The child in a darkened room in Holland, listening to a hidden phonograph, hearing something that proved the world could still contain beauty. You know, Ella said slowly, I was recording those songs and I had no idea who was listening, no idea what the music was going into. That's always the strange thing about recording. You make something in a studio and then it goes out into the world and you never know what it becomes for the people who receive it. It became, Audrey stopped. Her composure, which was considerable and professionally refined, showed the slight tremor of something real underneath. It became proof, that's what I said before. But I don't think I said it properly. It wasn't just proof that beauty existed somewhere. It was proof that I would exist somewhere it was beautiful, that there was a world on the other side of what I was living in and that I would eventually get there. Your voice was evidence of the world I was going toward. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said simply. The production assistant knocked twice to remind Ella that the car was waiting, and both times Ella waved the reminder away. They talked about music, about what Ella's records had meant in that dressing room in Holland, about the specific songs, about the way that certain recordings became attached to specific memories. They talked about the war, not at great length, not in detail that felt like excavation of things better left undisturbed, but enough that Ella understood something of what Audrey had lived. They talked about survival, about what you carry forward from the things that tried to break you, and how you carry it not as weight but as something else, something harder to name but present in the way you approach everything afterward. Both of them knew something about this, different catastrophes. Different specifics, but the underlying understanding was the same. You live past the worst, and then you try to make something of what remains. By the time Audrey left, with the apology for having stayed so long that Ella waved away, something had shifted. The meeting had not been what either of them might have anticipated, not the celebrity encounter, not the fan-meeting idol transaction, something more like recognition. Two people who had found something in each other that they hadn't known they were looking for. Before she left, Audrey turned at the door. "I wonder," she said carefully, "if next time you're in Europe, if it would be presumptuous to come again." "It wouldn't," Ella said. "I'd like that very much." "So would I." Over the following years, they developed what could only be called a friendship, though it existed in a register that didn't quite resemble most friendships, conducted as it was across continents and between two people whose public lives were enormous and whose private lives were carefully guarded. When Ella was touring Europe, which she did regularly, usually twice a year with Norman Grantz's Jazz at the Philharmonic tour, Audrey made a point of being in whatever city Ella was performing in if she possibly could. She would attend the concert always, sitting somewhere in the audience without announcement, without the apparatus of celebrity arrival. She would come backstage afterward. They would sit and talk about music, about Europe, about the strange experience of living a life that was conducted so largely in public that the private parts became increasingly precious. About children, Audrey had a son, Sean, born in 1960, and she talked about him with the particular intensity of a mother who has carried loss and understands what it means to have something that matters this much. Ella, who had adopted a son with Ray Brown earlier in the decade, understood this. They talked about aging and careers, about what it meant to be a woman whose value in the public world was partly constructed around youth and beauty, about the particular pressures of that. Ella's career was not built on visual beauty in the way that an actress's was, but she understood the underlying anxiety, the sense that the window was finite, that whatever you were going to do you had to do while the window was still open. They talked about Holland and Harlem, about the war in the streets, about the things you don't talk about in interviews. They were careful not to be photographed together, not because either of them was ashamed of the friendship. Entirely the opposite, but because the friendship was one of the few genuinely private things either of them had, and they valued it precisely for that reason. The moment it became public, it became something else. It became story, became content, became material for the machinery of celebrity that both of them had learned to navigate while trying to protect what was real underneath. Their last meeting, as far as anyone could establish afterward, was in 1990. Ella was performing in Switzerland, Zurich, a venue she had played many times. Audrey was living outside Lausanne, as she had been for years, and she drove to Zurich for the concert. By 1990, both of them were older and less well than they had been. Ella's diabetes and eye problems had been progressing for years. Audrey, though nobody would know for another year when she was diagnosed, was already carrying the colon cancer that would kill her in January 1993. They met backstage after the concert. Ella, now 73, moved more slowly, required assistance with some things. Audrey, 61, was thinner than she'd been in recent years. They sat together in a small room and talked for an hour. What they talked about, nobody knows. Nobody was present except the two of them. When Audrey left, she embraced Ella in the doorway, held her for a moment. Ella said later, to no one in particular, because she didn't mention the friendship publicly, that she had known something was wrong with Audrey that night, that there was a quality to the goodbye that felt different. She was right. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993. She was 63 years old. Ella Fitzgerald, 75 years old in 1993, did not speak publicly about the friendship. She received the news of Audrey's death and absorbed it privately, the way she absorbed private things, without announcement, without the public processing that had become normalized in an era that increasingly demanded the sharing of grief as well as joy. She kept what they had by keeping it private. It had been private for 35 years. It would remain private. When Ella herself died in June 1996, her papers were eventually organized and some correspondence was found, including letters, a small number, carefully preserved from Audrey Hepburn, covering 3 decades, written in the same precise, elegant script that had been on the note delivered to the Teatro Sistina dressing room in October 1958. Audrey's son Sean, who had known something about the friendship from his mother, confirmed what the letters suggested, that it had been real, consistent, and deeply valued by both women. "My mother called her the voice of grace," Sean said, years after both were gone. "She said that when she was a child in Holland and the world had become very dark, she would hear this voice and believe that somewhere, despite everything, people were still making beautiful things, and that this had stayed with her for the rest of her life." He paused. She also said, and I think this is the thing that explains why they got along so well, that Ella Fitzgerald was one of the very few people she had ever met who understood what it meant to have survived something and then made something beautiful afterward, not because of what happened to you, but in spite of it, and because of what was in you all along. The voice she had carried from Holland, first as a child in a darkened room listening to hidden records while the war happened outside, then as a young woman finding her way in a world that had survived the war but been changed by it forever, then as a woman who had made an extraordinary life, who had become the face on 100 million movie screens, and who still, decades later, came backstage in quiet clothes to sit with a jazz singer and talk about what music was for. Ella Fitzgerald never knew during her lifetime how completely she had been heard. By the audiences, by the record buyers, by everyone who had ever written a letter or stood in line for a concert or simply listened, alone, late at night, to a voice that seemed to know something about enduring. She never knew about the child in Holland, who grew up to be Audrey Hepburn, who never forgot.